Way of physical description, I am a middle-aged Caucasian cisgender woman with an auburn pixie cut and wearing a turquoise cardigan today. And I am joined by my colleague, Linnell Hansen, with the Arrowhead Area Agency on Aging, and she'll be managing our technology and chat today. We'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for today's session on overcoming loneliness, strategies for helping people with mental illnesses. Before we start, we have a few housekeeping items. So next slide. We are excited to announce that today's webinar will be accessible to a wider audience. We have arranged for ASL interpreters who will be present throughout the session. These interpreters will rotate about every 20 minutes, ensuring that everyone can follow the content effectively. To access that interpretation feature, you just need to click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen. Additionally, we will be recording the entire webinar with ASL interpretation, and these recordings will be available on our YouTube channel for later viewing. So whether you attend a live session or catch up later, you will have the opportunity to engage in the material in a way that suits your needs. I encourage you to subscribe to our channel so that you can keep up with the latest additions to our video library. We are always looking for suggestions for webinar topics. So if you've got suggestions for topics or speakers, please feel free to send those to me at my email, which I will share in the chat. Just a couple of things. Please keep your microphone set to mute. If you have any issues with your bandwidth or with audio quality, it often helps to disable your camera. If you'd like, you can enter your name and your organization or community that you're from in the chat, what you're hoping to get out of today's session or how you found out about it. If you have any questions during today's session, please feel free to enter your questions into the chat and we'll address them at the end of the presentation. At the close of session today, you will see a quick evaluation of the session that'll pop up. Please take a moment to complete that survey. It helps us greatly when we're planning future sessions. So one last quick reminder to visit our Facebook page for more information about upcoming sessions, such as our January session on building circles of care, prevention, support, and healing for sexual violence in later life, and our February session on managing money, a caregiver's guide to finances. You can also check out our website at arrowheadaging.org. Next slide, just a little bit about the Arrowhead Area Agency on Aging. We are designated as by the Minnesota Board on Aging as the Area Agency on Aging for the service and planning area under the authority of the Title III of the Older Americans Act. The Arrowhead Area Agency on Aging is committed to helping older adults maintain their highest levels of independence. Area agencies on aging are regional organizations that provide services, supports, and information on just about everything that older adults and their families might need. Minnesota has 7 AAAs across the state that are the local connections for older Minnesotans and community supports they might need as they age. Our Arrowhead Area Agency on Aging planning area, as designated by the Board on Aging, includes the counties of Aiken, Carlton, Cook, Itasca, Koochiching, Lake, and St. Louis County. Now, I'm just going to take a moment to read our Arrowhead Area Agency on Aging land acknowledgement. Next slide. As we support our mission to help older adults maintain their highest level of independence, we do this while being respectful of the space that we are being welcomed into by Indigenous people. We strive to deepen our understanding of the multiple ways in which people see and understand land and acknowledge the Indigenous people who have relationships with this land. We also acknowledge the decades of historic trauma, loss, and grief experienced by Indigenous people. It is our promise to not only recognize these truths, but also take action to show support for our Indigenous elders, neighbors, and friends, and understand our place within the past, present, and the future of this land. We know that this is just one step in recognizing and honoring the sovereignty of tribal nations. So we are honored today to be joined by today's presenter, Kay King from NAMI, Minnesota. Kay is a community educator for NAMI Minnesota, the National Alliance on Mental Illness of Minnesota, and is the Older Adults Program Coordinator and Faith Community Liaison. Each year, she teaches about 4,000 families, professionals, community members, and people living with mental illness about good mental health, suicide prevention, and mental illness. She is a former executive director of a retirement community with independent and assisted living and a general manager of large hotels and resorts nationally and internationally. Kay is a family member and has worked for NAMI for 17 years. Kay, thank you so much for being with us today, and I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thanks so much, Brenda, and delighted to join you. I work in the state office for NAMI, which is in St. Paul, but we have affiliate chapters, and we actually have an affiliate chapter in Duluth. It covers the Arrowhead region. It's volunteer run, so if that's something you're interested in, mental health education and mental health support, they would love to have volunteers, so you're very welcome to join them, and I can put you in touch with them. I actually want you to know we do three things at NAMI. We do education, we do support, and we do advocacy. We're not direct service providers, so I'm not a clinician. I'm not a master's level social worker. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not a specialist, who has an internship in a residency called a psychiatrist. But we think, pretty good educators, and we also provide lots of support services. And we do lots of legislative work. That's the advocacy part of NAMI. There are NAMI state chapters in all states but North Dakota right now. So we try to help out North Dakota the best we can. And our national office is in Washington, D.C. And I'm going to give you my contact information. You are always welcome to take out your camera and take a picture of a slide. But best way to reach me is by email because I'm teaching a lot, but I do get back to people quickly when I get an email, especially at the end of the day. So please take down this information, and certainly Brenda knows how to get a hold of me. The objectives, I want you to understand a little bit impact of loneliness. It's a pretty hot topic. I would think you've heard some things already. I have the lens today of talking about the importance of engaging family members because family members provide most of the care for people managing a mental illness. And it's a common illness. And I'm a family member, as Brenda mentioned. I was born to a mother who already lived with mental illness. She was in college at the University of Minnesota in the Twin Cities campus when she had a break from reality. And that's what psychosis is, break from reality. My mom was hospitalized at Fairview Riverside. It's called St. Mary's at the time. And after some period of time, she got better, went back to college. My dad had already graduated from Gustavus, a small private school in St. Peter, Minnesota, and he was getting an MBA in Harvard. And this is right as World War II is breaking out. So my dad was called up by the National Guard and did serve 4 years in World War II. My mom went back to college after that first hospitalization, but she had another break from reality and was hospitalized again. So she went to work instead of going back to college. And when they were 25 and my dad was out of the military, they got married. And they settled in Le Sueur, Minnesota, which is southern Minnesota between Mankato and Minneapolis. And that was my dad's hometown. So my mom and dad had my sister about 2 years later. And my sister, when she was 15 and I was 7, and there's just the two of us, she developed the same illness as my mom, which is bipolar disorder. So my mom was 18, my sister was 15. My sister today is in her 70s, and she manages bipolar disorder, but she's lived with it a long time. And there's hope in that. I mean, people manage illnesses. You manage diabetes, you manage Parkinson's disease, you manage multiple sclerosis. There's lots of things that unfortunately befall us. You manage cancer. But family members play a huge role. And also want you to know a few strategies. We're just together for less than an hour now. And so, take some other classes. I teach 25 different classes. I have many colleagues that teach a wide range of classes. And you can find some classes that are online. And so knowing our website is helpful, NAMIMN.org, or put in NAMI Minnesota. If you just put in NAMI, you're going to go to our national website, which is a good website, but it doesn't tell you what's happening in Minnesota. And then some strategies for communities, because people do better with the support of others, which includes community. So Dr. Murthy was our Surgeon General until December of last year. So he's been out of office about a year. And he commissioned and contributed to a report about loneliness in 2023. And so this is a quote. Our epidemic of loneliness and isolation has been an underappreciated public health crisis that has harmed individual and societal health. Our relationships are a source of healing and well-being hiding in plain sight, one that can help us live healthier, more fulfilled, and more productive lives. Loneliness and isolation has been around probably since humankind, but I think putting a focus on it again, especially in 2023, after we're coming off the worst of COVID, I think, put a punctuation point on the issue that it is important. And social media certainly has contributed to some isolation and loneliness. And loneliness and isolation certainly aren't just in older adults. That my background, is some in older adults. And just know that certainly it is a factor for older adults, but it is for young people, really people of all ages. So, social isolation, folks that have really few social relationships don't belong as much. I know churches that I'm a faith liaison, I know churches and synagogues where they still offer online services because people are used to them, they like them, they're convenient. It's winter in Minnesota, so you don't have to get in the car to get to your faith community. And yes, you can still worship, but part of community is seeing each other, having a cup of coffee together after the service. And so, in some ways, we've gotten into habits where we are more isolated, and we've just continued those even after we didn't have to, due to the COVID restrictions at the time when we did have to. The other thing is that, loneliness, it's subjective. One person's introversion is another person's extroversion. I'm extroversion to the max. And so people enjoy their own company, but that's a little bit different. Usually loneliness is distressing and could be perceived isolation or needs not being met. And just know that it is a concern. And that's why Dr. Murthy, did a Surgeon General report on the topic. And you can read the full report, at your convenience, but it was from 2023. Now, you probably read this in the news when that report came out. It said, the impact of loneliness can be about the same as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And I think that's really a sharp contrast way to look at it. We all know smoking is bad for us, but 15 cigarettes a day, loneliness has some of the same impact as that. And so it really is important for us to think about civil engagement and how we can connect again through volunteering, or we can connect again through paid work, or we can connect again through social clubs. I call them the animal clubs. That would be the Rotary, the Lions, the Moose, the Elk, today, Women of Today. There's lots of organizations that can provide not only good service projects, Rotary does great service projects, but also it's a way to have community. Now, there's some factors that impact loneliness. If you have a chronic disease, example again, like diabetes, or could be something like a mental illness concern like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, or you have some physical related disabilities. It could be that you have some sensory and functional impairments. Autism is a spectrum disorder that might be considered a sensory impairment. You could live with a mental illness. Lots of people do. And if you don't know this, 1 in 5 adults in a given year are managing a mental illness. That's 20% of our population. It's not all really severe. It could be mild, could be moderate, could be severe. My sister lives with really severe bipolar disorder. My mom was a librarian in Le Sueur, Minnesota. My mom and dad owned a restaurant. My dad had a substance use disorder. They made a living. They were parents. They lived a life, but they struggled. It could be physical health that impacts loneliness. Because think about it, if you have a physical disability, think how hard it is here in the winter. It's really hard, maybe you have an adapted van or something like that, but it is really, really hard to get around. And people tend to get more isolated in the winter. If you're an older adult, you certainly don't want to fall. Falls can be fatal. Falls can lead to, especially if you're frail, to an earlier death. And so we're careful. And when we're careful, we get more isolated. I think we all aspire probably to live independently. And there's value in that. And in that same school of thought. However, living in an apartment building where a company is just 20 feet away, the next door in the apartments that are in your floor, is so much easier to have company than it is when you live in a house that doesn't have an attached garage and that the neighbor you have to walk outside on icy sidewalks to get to some company. or you have to walk to a garage because it's not attached and there's a risk of fall. So older adults often get very, very isolated in the winter. And I'm from a small town, so transportation can be a huge issue as well. You may not drive anymore, maybe you never did drive, and depending on others for transportation, you can get pretty isolated as well. Plus, it's just cold out. We've had a bout of cold already. The other thing is that, socioeconomic status, it's really hard to do some activities. The activities that we think of, going out to eat, it's expensive. Going to a movie, it's expensive. Going to an activity like a concert or a play, it's expensive. And, people that are older adults, really more than 48% of older adults live on Social Security alone. It's not their fault. It's not that they spent their money unwisely. It's that we maybe didn't earn enough to have more than what we needed to pay our rent and pay our utilities and pay for groceries. And we just did not have the ability to set aside money. So now Social Security, the average Social Security check is slightly over $21,000. You can't live on $21,000. So it's really hard. So, impact of loneliness, just know that the 29% increase in heart disease, and these are from the Surgeon General. 32% increase in a risk of stroke when loneliness is involved. And mind you, this is on a continuum also. 55% greater risk of hospital readmission. Now, these aren't cause and effect. It's just that you should know that it's a greater risk than the general population. Higher risk of obesity, and obesity has ramifications with things like diabetes, and obesity, has ramifications for other health conditions, cardiovascular conditions, and things like that. If you already manage diabetes or you're pre-diabetic, certainly loneliness can make it worse, or actually tip you from pre-diabetes perhaps to diagnosed diabetes. Control of blood pressure is harder when you're lonely. And then, I think we all worry a little bit about dementia. The highest risk factor for dementia is Alzheimer's. That's the most common of the dementias, but there's different kinds. There's Lewy body dementia, as an example, Parkinson's dementia, different kinds, but Alzheimer's is the most common. So none of us, wish to see a 50% increase in dementia because dementia right now, there's some treatments that slow it down a little, but not a lot. There's no cure for dementia. You probably have lived with it almost 10 years before it's diagnosed. So it's tricky. The other thing is that suicidal ideation, and that's something we care a lot about at NAMI. We do quite a few suicide prevention classes. I teach one tomorrow, for example. And so that you're at greater risk for suicide. Doesn't mean cause and effect. With loneliness equals that you're going to attempt suicide, but it's a higher risk factor. Untreated depression is a high risk factor for suicide. And obviously, as an educator in suicide prevention, that's something I work very, very hard to try to educate people about. So this is a side note, but please take a QPR class. It stands for Question, Persuade, Refer. And QPR is an hour and a half. We teach it online, cameras on, and it's offered at least twice a month. So if you go to the NAMI Minnesota website, you can actually take a QPR class. And they're offered in Duluth from time to time. You can perhaps take an in-person class, but the class online is quite effective. So we know that when you have social connection with people, especially people you care about, you get better eating habits as a result. We associate it with better exercise, better sleep, and adherence, treatment adherence, not just for mental health issues, but for things like diabetes as well. And when you have social connections, it really helps our emotional state of mind and really reduces relapses in mental health related issues and hospitalizations. Most people receive their mental health treatments in the community, not in hospitals. The average length of stay in a mental health unit is 3 nights. And so know that, community is everything, and that's probably the most effective place to receive your mental health care. So with social connection, just know that the variety and number of relationships you have, some of it is, how you can rely on others. This could be family. I don't have kids of my own, so I've really had to build community among friends. And so know that, yes, I have two nieces, but, family doesn't always live where you live. So some of the connections you have are people that might be available to give you a ride. Some of the people you have connections with might share your same spiritual background. Some of the people that you have relationships with are best friends. And in Minnesota, a lot of us have best friends from kindergarten. I do. I've lived elsewhere, but I moved back to Minnesota and I already have a built-in network of people that I went to college with and people I went to grade school with. And also the quality. I mean, just having acquaintances, but not much quality to it, that's different also. So we have different levels of quality among our acquaintances, our friends, our family. Sometimes family are our best friends too, and sometimes vice versa. Um, Best friends are family. So there's some barriers, to social connection. And you may not know this, so I'm just going to share this, is that 50% of people who are going to have a mental illness concern usually have that by age 14. It's a young person's onset. And that figure rises to 75% of people who are going to have a mental illness have it by 26. Now, that still leaves 25% of the population that might develop a mental illness after age 26, but the majority, 75%, are by age 26. So it's good to know some basics about mental illness. We have some classes that teach about the basics. We also have family classes. They're 8 weeks long. I've taught family to family class for 19 years and 8 weeks long. And so if you're a family member, that's a great class. It's a great class. The other thing is that, mental illnesses affect our thinking, our feeling, our thoughts, and our relationships with others. I think of my brain as kind of the master computer board. You know, I took biology late 70s for full disclosure. Controls my breathing, my brain controls my heartbeat, and then all these other things, thinking, feeling, thoughts, relationships. So it's really important we learn about it and we take good care of our brain. So people who have psychosis, remember I said that's a break from reality? People who have psychosis, it's not an illness. You can have psychosis with bipolar disorder. You can have psychosis with schizophrenia. You can have psychosis with Lewy body dementia. You can have psychosis with substance use disorder. But typically, people who have breaks from reality, hallucinations, delusions, those are examples of things that might show up with a break from reality. They have fewer social relationships beyond family members, and partly because of the symptoms. And they occur young. And young people, when I say young people, I mean 15 to 22, 23. Young people really don't know how to, to continue those relationships with friends who develop these illnesses in that time frame. Most of these illnesses happen by age 26. And friends and stuff, they don't quite know what to do or how to maintain a relationship with somebody who sometimes has symptoms that are hard to deal with. So part of this is to educate people so they know how to do that. But that's part of the problem is that people drop away. They're not mean people that don't want to have a relationship with someone that was their best friend in high school. It's just that they don't know how to handle someone who has delusions or someone who has other things like things like that, which by the way are very treatable. The other thing is, think about, I hope some of you have visited people in a mental health unit, right? How do people call their family members? Well, first of all, you don't get your cell phone to use while you're in a mental health unit. And there's phones that are used by everybody on the unit. And if you want to call in, you might have to let it ring and ring, and someone might pick it up, someone might not. Depends who's nearby those phone banks. How do family members call their loved one? They can't call a cell number, they can't text, and we're used to doing all of that. Other parts of the hospital, they honestly don't have visiting hours. You can kind of visit someone who's your family that's sick in the hospital pretty much 24/7. I don't recommend it because they need their sleep, but new baby, you can visit at 2 in the morning. But in a mental health unit, there's very restricted visiting hours, partly because they're doing therapy and things like that during mostly daytime hours. So if you call the main number of the hospital that has a mental health unit, can you be connected? Doesn't always work very well. I have lots of personal experience. since people can't have their devices, and I'm going to just take a drink of water. Since people don't have their devices, you have to use old-fashioned methods like get well cards, sending them something by mail, or having flowers delivered. I've been in lots of mental health units for my family and for friends, and I'm not seeing the same sort of things that I see in the units that, have people that are general surgery or a new baby, things like that. The other thing is that if family members are not engaged by professionals, then that's a social connection for people because folks are going to go home and they go home to their family. The majority of people, even though they're not fully recovered yet, it takes almost a year or more to get back where you were, right? You come home to family. And if you don't engage the family, that's one of the most important social connections for the person. Now, typically, professionals like medical doctors or a psychiatrist or a psychologist or an advanced practice registered nurse, typically they're not asking questions like, well, how many friends do you have? This is as managing the mental illness. How many friends do you have? Who are your friends? Tell me a little bit about them. How are you connected with your family? Are you estranged or do you have a good relationship with your family? Do you live with family? Are your family nearby? Typically, those aren't asked, and they are so important to someone's recovery. So, part of what I want you to do, because some of you could be family members, is to know that if that's not being done by the professional, I'd like to think they do it, but I know from a fact that most do not. It's important for you to ask for that, right? Just say, when you're talking to my family member, do ask them some of these questions because those are important for their recovery. Now, Michael J. Fox, you probably know, a famous actor, and lives with Parkinson's. He's lived with it since his 20s, and he's done remarkably well, but I think it's more progressed now than it has been. So, this quote is from him: family is not an important thing, it is everything. So, he doesn't live with a mental illness, but nobody gets better from an illness alone. And so they really, really, all of us rely on family for support, not just with mental illness, but very much so with mental illness compared to some of the other illnesses. And this is a quote too, and don't know who actually wrote it, but family is family, whether it's the one you start out with, the one you end up with, or the family you gain along the way. And for me, friends are so important because they are my family. I have a tiny family. My sister is not really able to step up and be a sister to me. Often I find myself almost in a parental role with her. And when my mom was ill and I was little, I was in a parental role with her, not exclusively, but during times of symptoms and things like that. My sister lives in adult foster care. Her husband died 23 years ago of cancer, and she no longer could live independently. So she lives with three other people in adult foster care. And I'm her healthcare power of attorney. She receives day-to-day care from staff, in the adult foster care. But, I just want sometimes just have a sister, right? Or I just wanted to have a mom, right? Instead, I played a different role, which isn't very enjoyable when you're a kid. So, I'm not going to spend much time on definition of family, but really two or more persons who are bound together over time by ties of mutual consent, by ties of birth and or adoption or placement, and who together assume responsibility for some of the following. So we don't need to go through the following, and this is from the Vanier Institute, but family is not just birth families. That's why I like that paragraph. Our how we form families really is widely different. And I think that's part of the richness of our culture. So even as adults, we rely on family members after we've had a new baby. Maybe you've helped out taking care of grandchildren, or maybe you've helped out a friend or a sibling that's just had a new baby. That's where we call when we're making Thanksgiving dinner and we don't remember the recipe. We call a family member. When we're moving, I don't know how old do you have to be? This is a side. How old do you have to be before you don't ask your family to bring the truck over and move you and use a professional mover? I just laugh. I mean, pretty soon, your back just can't do it anymore. But, a lot of us depend on family for moving. Also, if you're short money, who do you turn to? If you maxed out your credit card and you have a car repair, you have a copay that's really high for a medical procedure, well, who do you turn to? And often that is family. Holidays, who do we wish to spend our time with? Sometimes friends, but friends can be family too. So you can certainly put in other items in the chat because believe me, as adults, not just with mental illness, we rely on family members for lots of things. So you are very welcome to put items in the chat. I can't teach and look at the chat at the same time, so I will, ask, Brenda, if you can step in. If you see anything, you just say it if somebody's put something in the chat. Now, the majority of people that receive care for mental health are between the ages of 18 to 39, and it is often a parent taking on the care of an adult child, 45%. So, I teach family classes, I mentioned, and my last 8-week class just ended last week. And I have 80-year-olds in my class that have 60-year-old children. Those children were ill long before they were 60, but their parents are still helping them and are still concerned about them and are even worried now, like who's going to take care of them when I'm gone. And just know that the majority of caregivers, 55% report that they were included less than they felt they should have been in care conversations with the providers. And this is in mental health. So this comes actually from a study that, although the study's a few years old, it really, still applies. It's from a study called Pins and Needles. So if you put in the search pins and needles, it's really a very interesting report, but it does talk about families' role in mental illness. Now, with family involvement, which, we want to encourage health professionals to include families since that's where most people are going home to. And I don't mean literally, they may live in an apartment, but family is still providing some help with rent, maybe paying for a cell plan, maybe making sure there's food in the house so that the person gets their nutrition that they need. But, HIPAA is a good thing, because, we don't want in the olden days when people would lock people away in state hospitals because perhaps of mental health concerns or from a domestic violence standpoint, even might have had them locked away saying they were mentally ill. HIPAA is useful, but sometimes it's a shield that prevents families to be involved. Because if our family member does not sign a release and they're 18 and older, then sometimes the health professional can't communicate with the family members. Now, we have a good booklet at NAMI Minnesota that talks about family involvement and does address some of the things with HIPAA. So I'm not going to use the time today for that. But sometimes, health professionals just don't understand the impact of serious mental illnesses on families. There are huge impacts. And that's why taking a family to family class, if you're a family member, can be so helpful. And surprisingly, in this day and age, that there's still that blaming of families. Somehow you did something during pregnancy and that was why the person has mental illness, or your family didn't pray enough, or, you have enabled your family member, to do things. Families are not to blame. As a matter of fact, they should be praised. And I hope you don't mind the last one. No one looks good in a crisis. That includes families and that includes the person who's struggling. So sometimes, I have an understanding. I'm not a health professional. I understand it's sometimes difficult to involve families. Usually you can't bill for it. And that's an issue. If you work for a healthcare system, they're expecting you as a doctor or as an advanced practice RN to have lots of billable hours. And, when you spend time with families, it isn't very billable. And there's some theories, and these theories are in quotes, right? That parents were overprotective. That's why the person lives with mental illness. Or parents were cool or indifferent. Families enabled this bad behavior. Families have sabotaged treatment. The family is dysfunctional, so a child never stood a chance. It must be the parent's fault. I'm sure there's a few people that some of these things apply to, but by and large, families are the support system and they care a lot. I was born to a mother who was already ill. When I was 7, my sister was 15. I've been in this for the long haul. And now in the last part of my career, 17 years, I'm working in mental health education. And believe me, it's not enough money to live on to work at NAMI. So I just want you to know that I'm passionate about this. And I hope that if you are a family member too, or you're a health professional, that you'll take some of our classes, not just the family one. You do have to be a family member for that one. The other thing is that when someone gets diagnosed or someone has some health issues that you sent them off to school and they didn't have them, they went off to college and all of a sudden, they've had a break from reality. That is a catastrophic stressor. It's a traumatic event in a family. And there's not a lot of community support. You don't even feel comfortable because of stigma and discrimination. You don't even feel comfortable telling your neighbors or telling one of your best friends. So you feel all by yourself. You really don't even think you're the only person, in your faith community that has a family member that's ill, or you think I'm the only one in the block, or you think I'm the only one at work. In actuality, it's really common, 20% of the population in a given year. The lifetime prevalence for mental illness is 50%, 50. 50% of us. Now, it might be one incident of postpartum depression, and that would get counted. And then you don't go on to have any other issues after that, but it would still be counted in that 50%. So, from that pins and needles study that I suggest you look at, it says nearly half in that study, 48% of caregivers said it was difficult to talk with others about their loved ones' mental health or emotional health issues. There's a lot of stigma. I hear people openly talk about breast cancer, mastectomy, chemotherapy, radiation. Who knew we would talk so openly about breast tissue and talk about the brain? And, we work really hard. You work hard as well, especially if you know someone and love someone that lives with mental illness, to reduce that stigma and discrimination. Because we want to have people get the help they need. But if a young person thinks that they're going to be name called, crazy nuts, cuckoo, things like that, or they think that they're not going to get a job promotion, then you don't seek help. And so we want people to get the help they need. So bad things don't happen, like not finishing high school, or bad things don't happen like getting in the criminal justice system. Once you have a misdemeanor or felony, it's really hard to get housing. It's really hard to get a job. Not that you won't, but it's harder. So all those things, play a role. And then there's loss of dreams, and this is from a family standpoint, but it's loss of dreams for the person who also has developed the illness. Age of onset is so young. And in that young time is when you usually graduate high school. You usually go on to some post-secondary education. You find the love of your life kind of in your 20s, maybe. If you're going to have children, you maybe have those, by mid 30s. Well, that's when these mental illnesses occur. Doesn't mean those things won't happen, but they might be delayed in whatever the timeline, the preferred timeline, I put that in quotes, in the US, but they might, be and a different timetable, but their friends are marching to the timetable that society seems to expect. So they fall by the wayside, those friends. They're all having kids, so they hang out with other people that have kids, and you don't have your kids yet. They finish high school and they go off to the University of Minnesota Duluth, and you're going to eventually go to school, but you aren't right now because you're struggling with your mental health. So then you get out of sync, and when you're out of sync, then those friends fall by the wayside. Hopes and dreams in my family class, probably almost 20 years ago when I took the class, not when I taught it. There was a dad who was telling his story in class, and he was sobbing. He loved working on muscle cars, kind of those hot rod kind of cars, and he had 4 boys. He was so thrilled when he had boys. He thought, oh, I'm in the garage with, putting together cars and working on cars. 3 of his 4 sons developed schizophrenia. That's really uncommon, but they did. And those sons are not able to do that. And so he was sobbing as he told that story. Now, is he a good dad and he changed, and is approaching life a little differently? But he loss of thinking that he was going to have 4 daughters-in-law because there were no girls in the family, and that he was going to be working in the garage on cars with these boys. Now, I haven't talked to him for 20 years, and maybe some of that has occurred, but at that moment, he felt a lot of grief and loss. And sometimes you have to just adjust. Maybe you have to use some money to help your adult children. And you thought you were going to retire at 60 instead of 65 or 70. And now, financially, you can't afford to do that because you're helping adult children. So, ambiguous loss. There's a great book by Pauline Boss. She is retired, but she was a professor at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. And she wrote a book on ambiguous loss. And when someone's ill, or if someone has something like a dementia, that really is an ambiguous loss. So that book is very helpful if you've never read it, but it's Pauline Boss, Boss. Now, I should just ask you, Brenda, is there anything in the chat? Because as I told you, I can't do the chat at the same time.
Nope, we're good right now. I added some things in there as you were talking about connections to NAMI Duluth for volunteering and classes through NAMI Minnesota.
Oh, thanks. Really appreciate it. Now, Mental health parity, if you have a health insurance plan through your workplace, there is a law about mental health parity. You can't have copays that are different for mental health than physical health. But we get calls at NAMI at least monthly where the health plans, like a Blue Cross Blue Shield or UCare, any of those kinds of health plans, are actually not following parity. Now, if you don't have an employer health plan and you receive your health plan a different way, like through MNsure, mental health parity is not part of that. But in employer plans, the national law is that you have to treat mental health issues the same way as you do physical issue. Out-of-pocket maximums can't be different for mental health than they are for physical health. And the other thing is that sometimes people have no income. I don't honestly know where people think that, people that are receiving a Social Security disability, that they're living a large life. You can't live on Social Security disability. It's helpful if you can't work for a while, but it's not meant to be forever. People want to work. And so it may get you as a safety net for a while, but it isn't enough to live on. There's nothing rich about it at all. The other thing is that, if you're a family member, you might have to take off work to take care of someone with mental health concerns. Same would be true if you had a child that had leukemia. And that means that you, as a family member, are going to have reduced wages that are eventually your Social Security. If you have to take off 5 years to help or work part-time, that affects, as a caregiver, that affects your income as well. And so from that pins and needles study, nearly half, 49% of caregivers said that their loved one is financially in friends. So again, family is most everything. And government programs are not the majority of ways that people get help with their basic needs. And the other thing is that, needing a place for a loved one to live. My sister now is in a wheelchair, and it's related to for her taking medication more than 60 years. And she's at great risk for falls. She's had some concussions because those are some of the long-term side effects of the medication she's taken for so many years. Um, I, I guess I could be a full-time caregiver. My house isn't even adaptable. She's lived in Mankato all her adult life, and that's where her faith community is. That's where her medical providers are. Doesn't make a lot of sense for me to be out of the workforce taking care of her day to day. So I've made sure she's safe living in adult foster care. I visit regularly, and I provide, the healthcare power of attorney. But, just these are some of the things that maybe you hadn't thought of. Sometimes families are not in agreement. They think, well, my gosh, someone has a substance use disorder and they should just snap out of it. Well, you just don't snap out of mental health concerns and you don't just snap out of things like substance use disorder. And family members aren't always in agreement. Parents aren't always in agreement. Siblings might not agree with how the parents understand the mental illness. I've heard siblings say things like, well, why are you paying for the cell phone plan and the rent for my brother? You didn't do that for me. So, I mean, there's often people seeing it differently. Why don't you just kick them out of the house and, let them fend for themselves? They're lazy. And in actuality, it's an illness. And so it's good for people to get educated. Sometimes professionals say things like, well, they're going to have to live with this forever. What hope is there in that? I know lots of people, and I mean lots of people, thousands of people I know personally that, are living a life. And not everybody has really severe mental illness. And even if they do, most people get better. Not always cured, but most people get better. So, you want to involve the family because no one gets through a serious illness by themselves, not just mental illness, any serious illness by themselves. People change jobs, people change positions. Sometimes they change through divorce, their core family, but the rest of our family is there for the long term by and large. And so people do better when there's continuity, and family provides continuity. And families fill in not just financially, but emotionally when government programs fail or get underfunded. And most of us, me included, I'm in for the long haul. And I was born to a mother who was ill. So, I'm in my 60s. I'm in for the long haul. And families need the information because none of us learned anything in high school. You don't learn much about mental illness till it's right in front of you, till you get the call, saying that your child has not attended classes and they've hold themselves up in their dorm room and what's going on, or you see some actions that they're doing that are unusual. So then all of a sudden we get a crash course in what's mental illness. Or you're an employer and you see some things, or you have someone who's um, having actions at work that don't allow them to do their job effectively. And all of a sudden you get involved because you didn't know anything about mental illness before. So, we want health professionals to help maintain hope for family members and for the person themselves. We want good communication from healthcare providers. We need resources and information. Just if a health professional could say, did you know that there's something called NAMI? There's a state chapter you can call. There's a helpline for national NAMI or a helpline during business hours for NAMI Minnesota. Just doing that would at least get them down the path for finding a support group or finding classes and things like that. If you have an employee assistance program at work, an employer could say, did you know we have a benefits free for an employee assistance program? You can have some therapy sessions. It's anonymous. All we get reported is how many people used our employee assistance program at the end of the year, not that Kay King used it, right? So there's lots of things to learn, and best way to do it is take some classes or join our support groups. So doing a little bit of education as the professional is good, but there's not a lot of time for it, and they typically can't bill. But, as a professional, health professional, encourage, families to learn, to ask questions, encourage your patient to do the same. But sometimes you're seeing the professional seeing the patient when they're symptomatic, and a lot of that stuff doesn't stick when people are symptomatic. It's better to do that education with the person who's ill if the health professional does it after they're stable. Or when they're not stable, then do that with the family. And, who I would ask questions like this, and this would be either a health professional or a family saying, who does provide emotional support now to your family member? Who do they listen to for advice? Who's someone they have shared interests? It might be someone in their faith community that they really respect. It could be a best friend from high school. It could be one sibling that they feel connected to, whereas another sibling, they don't have a good relationship with. That's not the one who should give any suggestions at that moment. Active listening is really important when you have someone who's struggling with a mental health concern. Um, you know, just get acquainted. If it's someone that you're trying to help as a first aider or as a health professional, have some conversation starters and then share something about yourself as well. What sports do you like? Oh, you watch Vikings football. Well, I'm not a big fan, but I like basketball. And so then we talk a little bit about sports. But it's to make emotional and social connections, you have to know something about people. I'm an extrovert, so I'm pretty good at it. I can chat you up for 5 minutes and I'm going to know a lot about you. That's my nature. But you have to make a little effort if that's not your nature. And people do really well when you're curious. Tell me a little bit about your childhood. Hey, where did you grow up? And then you'll find the connections with people. Now, for someone who's isolated, and this isn't just older adults, I realize I'm talking to the Airhead AAA, but these are some things where you find community. And I've taken Tai Chi, for example, for 23 years. I started taking it at a Y, and now we don't do the Y because after the Y closed for COVID, it's back up and running. We have found other space and we do it outdoors about 8 months of the year. But Tai Chi, I've known the people in my Tai Chi class almost 23 years. And it's meditative, it's community. We get together for Chinese New Year's. It's really a great community for me. I also have game night at least once a month in the winter. I also play poker with four guys that live in adult foster care. And we don't play for money, but I play, at a house with four guys and we play, um, poker once a month. So there's different ways to find community. If someone has Alzheimer's, for example, there's the choruses. So I have one of my classmates from high school, a good friend, has early onset dementia. And so she and I are on Giving Voice Chorus. And so we actually sing. She has some dementia, not very much yet. And I'm the person that sings with her. She's not even an alto. And so we aren't in the same section in the chorus, but she loves it. I mean, she loves singing. I love singing. It's something we do together. So these are places where you can find community. One of my friends, Scott, lives with schizophrenia and he lives in a residence in downtown Minneapolis. And he loves snakes and reptiles and things. And his sister would take him to the Herpetology Society meeting, and she hates those sort of things. So she'd sit in the car and he'd go in. But, he wanted someone to go with him. So she found a neighbor in her neighborhood that also liked those things. So now her neighbor picks up Scott and they go to these Herpetology Society meetings. Nikki doesn't have to go anymore, which is she's thrilled because she doesn't like snakes and all that stuff. And Scott's made a friend. So I have to say that, think broadly. Things that could be relationship building, not just a one-off going to Wicked, at the High School Musical. If you have ideas too, please put them in the chat because there are ways to connect to others because loneliness is really, really hard, particularly hard for someone with mental illness, but also true for older adults. Now, you should know I'm on the board of directors of Friends and Co. It used to be called Little Brothers of the Poor, Friends of the Elderly, but they're statewide and they have phone coffee talk where you can be paired up with a volunteer with an older adult and you have regular phone conversations. I've been paired up with an older adult where I visit, in person. And so that's a volunteer gig. It's Friends and Co. And it really is appreciated. If you don't want to do that kind of engagement, we send out greeting cards about 5 times a year. So if you want to make greeting cards and write those, they go out and we get such wonderful thank you notes about really mail with postage stamps, cards that go out with a message that you write yourself. So there's ways like that you can get involved. Volunteering, Friends and Co. is just one. Also, there's drop-in centers for older adults. There's drop-in centers, they're called clubhouses. I just went down to southwestern Minnesota, and that area has lots of clubhouses for people that manage a mental illness, more than any place in the state. They have more than we have in the metro area. Almost every county in that part of the state um, has a clubhouse, and I've spoken at a couple of those clubhouses. So, you know, there's just a lot of opportunity. You can take pictures of these slides if you want to, so that you have some ideas. In multicultural communities, barbershops are gathering places, not just to get your hair cut, but actually places where there's social community, especially in the African American community. And we're rich in immigrants now, so know that's we have people from Somali. We're the largest Somalian population in the United States. We have the second largest Hmong population in the United States. So again, there are social opportunities also within ethnicity. I'm sure when my great grandparents came here from Germany, I know for sure I was told that my great grandparents did not speak English and pretty limited even as they had lived here for a while. They ran a grocery store, in North Minneapolis, but their language skills never improved that much, I'm told. And so just know that they belong to a faith community, that services were still held in German. And eventually, they assimilated. But the same thing is happening with our newer cultures that have moved here. You know, Befrienders, in faith communities, sometimes they're called friendly visitors, sometimes they're called befrienders, sometimes they're called Stephen's Ministry. And so those are other ways for people to volunteer and or have someone come and visit them through those programs through a faith community. Occupational therapists, we think that they're just to make hand braces and to work on, dexterity and things. But there are occupational therapists that actually have specialized in things like hoarding disorder. They really have a broad range of what they do as an occupational therapist. So again, that an occupational therapist is a health professional, so that might be something that's covered by insurance, but they do much more than just doing, people that have had stroke and need help with hand movement and things like that. So we have a motto at NAMI, not just NAMI Minnesota, but you are not alone. And it's true. People get better from mental health concerns, when you have the support of others. And this is a rich job for me. I get paid to work at NAMI, but this is the most fulfilling job that I've had. And I've run large hotels and resorts in Aruba, Richmond, Virginia, Hilton Head Island, South Carolina. And yes, allowed me to make some money so I could work for NAMI, but I have to say, it is very rewarding. And just know there is support out there, but we have to learn more. We have to fund that support. And so, um, Here's some of the things we do. You can take a picture of the slide you want, but I want to use our remaining time to talk about crisis resources. I don't ever do a class without talking a little bit about that. So I know that Brenda, if she hasn't already given you the crisis resources, she will send them to you by email. But here's my contact information again. You can take a picture of the slide, but I want to go through that crisis resource sheet very briefly. So take a picture of this if you need to get a hold of me. Email's best. Whoops, too soon. So let me just talk about the crisis resources. You probably know that 988 is a national number for crisis resources, and it's 24/7. You can call 988 if you're in a crisis for mental health or someone that you love or care about or you're trying to help is in crisis, and they can coach you. Now, when you call, they don't know exactly where you are, but they know you're in Minnesota because of the cell towers. So consequently, your call hopefully will roll to one of the call centers in Minnesota. We have 4 call centers. And you want to go to a call center if possible in Minnesota because every state has different mental health resources. Now, any call center in any state can help with the crisis part. It's all done by phone, but resources are very specific to states. So the goal would be for your call after you get prompted, it'll say, if you're a veteran, press 1. If you need Spanish, Espanol, do dos, which is 2. And all other callers stay on the line. And once you get connected, they'll help with the crisis. But then for resources for the next day or the next hour, it's best if you're talking to someone in Minnesota. So know that we are funded, our call centers, by a tax on your phone bill. Just like you've always paid for 911, just look at your bill. You're now being charged for 988. Some states do not have a permanent funding source. So there are about 13 states this year that did not have permanent money. They just had grants. And those grants were all canceled by our present government. So they had to scramble to try to fund those 988 call centers. Luckily in Minnesota, we had funded it with a tax, on the phone bill, which is good. And the calls are astronomical amount of calls. And when DOJ started making cuts to different departments, they actually this year made a huge cut to SAMHSA, Substance Abuse Mental Health Administration. That's the only federal government agency that exclusively works on mental health. And they had a staff of about 800 and they're down to 200 people. And so they manage 988. They don't manage the call centers, but they manage 988 nationwide. So from an advocacy standpoint, we really are concerned about that. Now, in Minnesota, we have mobile crisis teams. So on that crisis sheet that you're going to receive, if you haven't already, on that crisis sheet, just know that you can find the crisis number for every county in Minnesota, and we have 87 counties. So my sister lives in Blue Earth County, so obviously I want to have that number in my phone. Finally, on the back side of that sheet, there's some warm lines. People are lonely, and they're lonely all hours of the day. So there are warm lines in Minnesota. They're not therapists that answer those numbers. They are actually peer support specialists. So get some of those numbers in your phone and pass them on to people that you know that struggle with loneliness. One of them, Wellness in the Woods, actually has hours that go from about 5 at night till 9 a.m. in the morning. And people are lonely at all hours. On the backside also, because you live in greater Minnesota, there are some therapists that are paid for by the Department of Agriculture that are actual therapists, and you can make appointments with them. So take a look at the backside of that crisis resource sheet. Now, I'm done. Time's up. I could have talked a lot more. I'm thrilled that I was asked to speak. So thank you, Brenda. I can stay on, but let me just go to the slides so you can finish up the parts with yours.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Kate, so much for sharing both your experiences, your expertise, and your insights. You've given all of us a lot of tools and strategies that we can implement both in our families, in our own lives, in our communities, and in our work. For those of us who joined us today, we hope you found the information valuable and helpful in your efforts to support older adults in the Arrowhead region. As Kay emphasized, addressing social isolation really requires all of us working together, whether you're a family member, you're a service provider, or you're a community volunteer. So, a few quick reminders before we close. The webinar was recorded today and will be available on the website within the next few days. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us at the Arrowhead Area Agency on Aging if you have any questions about resources in our 7-county region. And we encourage you to share what you've learned today with colleagues and with your networks. I want to just again say thank you to Kay and NAMI Minnesota for this important partnership, and thank you to participants who for taking time out of your day to spend with us and to learn with us. Your commitment to supporting older adults and supporting each other in our communities really does make a difference. So have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone.